All right, I hope you're ready for a double feature CNF Friday. Should I even keep promoting the front runner? It's out there. I also have to remember that not everybody listens to every single podcast episode. There could be newbies with every podcast. Even though it's the 400th time I've spoken about it, it could be the first for someone else. Buy it from your favorite bookstore and leave ratings and reviews wherever you post, Amazon, Goodreads. I'm not going to read them because I don't want to go insane, but they do help. If you ever want to pay me for the show and for what I do, buying the book and subscribing to the two newsletters is key. Platform is currency. A little more about that later. Oh, but hold on a second. You want to hear an audio excerpt from The Front Runner, read by Roger Wayne? Mr. Wayne. Here you go.
Steve had done something no other runner had done, which gave him a warm feeling. With his singlet untucked and eventually cast off altogether, and barefoot, Steve jogged a victory lap around the stadium. The scoreboard listed the top 5 3-mile results from the schools: MANH for Manhattan College, 5th, WST for Washington State, 4th, back-to-back COLOs for Colorado, 3rd and 2nd, and atop the list, not OREG for Oregon, but PRE, 1305.3. With Steve's outdoor college track and field career over, he would have one more redshirt semester in the fall of 1973 at Oregon to run cross-country. He had to consider what post-collegiate running looked like for him. He would remain an amateur, but he had the wherewithal to know he was an attraction and that he had leverage. With the right degree of savvy, or redirecting the brashness he had historically reserved for his rivals toward the Amateur Athletic Union, he was testing the limits of amateur racing as it was currently structured. He planned on breaking new trail, which was something athletes did not do back then. Everyone else merely got in line and dealt with the necessary evil that was the amateur system. A week after NCAA championships, on June 16, 1973, after having initially balked at going to Bakersfield for the 3-day AAU championships, Steve came within 0.4 seconds of breaking the American 3-mile record in a time of 12:53.4. He was playing a game of chicken with the AAU. Steve thought its draconian authority over where and when an athlete could run was deeply un-American. This from an institution that purportedly gave the athlete full freedom to pick and choose. Steve had every intention of running in Europe under his own banner on his own time and dime, not the AAU's, the Declaration of Independence. I've run 5 years for my country on a team. Now I want to run for me. Still, by running in the AAU championships, Steve was throwing the AAU a bone. In return, Steve hoped for a travel permit from the AAU. He wanted to travel on his own schedule and run against those he deemed worthy, even make some money under the table. Steve began to realize that he and his peers had more power than they realized. If the athletes don't take the initiative in this, who will? We know the AAU and the American Olympic Committee won't. I hate to sound critical, but to me the AAU is just a bunch of old men taking medication so they can stay alive for another 4 years to hassle us. Right now I'm being hassled. I don't need it, really. The real question would be if Steve would race in the restoration meet at Hayward Field, scheduled for June 20, 1973, another exhibition meet, just like the Twilight meets, to raise money for renovations. The West stands were dilapidated and held together with spit and prayer. Bowerman was still spearheading the fundraising, and he had a headliner in Steve that could draw people out, the proceeds going into the Hayward Field coffers. Steve and the 1972 800-meter gold medalist Dave Waddle were supposed to leave for Europe on June 19. While in Bakersfield, Steve hatched an idea. Steve knew Dave Waddle was going to Europe with him. Hey, why don't you just come up to Eugene in a couple of days? They're trying to raise money to restore the stadium. We'll go after the world record in the mile. I'll bring you through in 2:56 for 3/4. Waddle had an apocalyptic kick. It was how he won his gold medal in Munich. Steve Prefontaine willing to be a rabbit? Why not? Steve knew Waddle was the superior miler, and Steve figured that the pair of them could team up for a special headlining event. Here, Steve was willing to sacrifice himself. He couldn't expect to win, but he knew his star power combined with Waddle's kick might break Jim Ryan's long-standing world record and raise a lot of money for Hayward Field. The pair were stark opposites. Waddle was tall, pale as a sheet, ran with a golf cap. He raced no longer than the mile and saved his energy for the end. He was soft-spoken, even bashful. Steve was shorter and would never cover that glorious mane of hair. He led from the front, mutton chops and dark mustache. Steve was also soft-spoken, but he carried a heavy fist. Waddle was more shy and didn't socialize much. Though Steve appreciated the quieter moments, he was just as comfortable being the center of attention. Waddle never drank. Steve made a sport of it. Dave Waddle was the NCAA mile champion, but he had never run faster than 3:57. Steve, to his credit, had run 3:55 earlier in the year in blustery conditions. Call it the Hayward magic. Deep down, Waddle knew he needed a better mile time if he was going to tell people the mile and not the 800 meters was his best event. Waddle had always wanted to run against Steve, and if that were to happen, Steve would have to drop down and set the pace. "I know his plan. He'll try to take me out and break me early," Waddle said. How close they got to that world record depended on Steve. He would sell out for Waddle, for Hayward Field. The day could not have been better on the eve of summer, balmy and windless. Wearing a Nike track and field t-shirt and Nike trainers, Steve checked in with a clerk shortly before his event was set to go. The stands were flush with 12,000 people. Waddle, who had just been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force Reserves, had been tabbed to run in the Air Force colors instead of his usual Bowling Green University kit. While in Eugene, a captain for the Air Force gave Waddle his uniform. Waddle wanted to focus on the race, and he wasn't sure if he was supposed to be saluting or calling him sir or not. Eventually, and unceremoniously, Waddle slipped away to warm up. The plan was simple: stay with Steve. Steve said he was going to pull them through in 2:56. His gift to Waddle. Waddle thought, he's the best rabbit you can have, except he's the type of rabbit who usually wins. Waddle was feeling good. He had slept 10 hours the night before and logged an easy 2-mile morning run. As race time neared, he jogged 2.5 miles as the stands swelled to the brim, hip to hip. Last time Waddle raced at Hayward Field was the Olympic trials a year before. After he tied the world record in winning the 800 meters, he went across the street to McDonald's and treated himself to a Big Mac meal. He wasn't much for ceremony or theatrics, and when he was called to the starting line for the Supermile, the people screamed, and Waddle began to tingle. Then he heard the screams for Steve. Whoa. The race went off, and just like Steve told Waddle, he paced him through 3/4 of a mile in 2:56, Steve hugging the inside lane, and Waddle coasting to the outside of Steve's right shoulder. Waddle had never gone faster than 3:01 for 3/4. Steve's legs felt heavy, and at this point, he wanted to explode. He had run 4 3-mile races in 13:20 or below in 10 days. The acceleration wasn't there. He had no snap. Waddle was told by his Bowling Green coach that his best races would come off a fast pace, and right there before him on a platter was about as fast as he'd ever experienced. Steve put the world record in Waddle's sights. All Waddle had to do was take it. Steve rushed by the east stands with 220 yards to go. Fans knew the book on Waddle, and right on cue, Waddle surged 10 yards clear of Steve. There would be no catching Waddle, but Steve chased after him not only to keep up with the clock, but to give his people in the rickety west stands reason to cheer. Maybe the roar would push Waddle past the point of reason, past Ryan. By the time Waddle struck the tape, the time was 3:53.3, the third fastest mile ever. Waddle winced at the finish. Steve finished a few yards behind Waddle and gave his people all that remained, what would be his career best mile, 3:54.6. A little girl screamed, "That's okay, Pre. Don't worry about it." Years later, Waddle looked back at this race with a rare pang of regret. So much of his mindset was geared toward winning the race, not the clock. Time was secondary. He never wanted to sell out too soon. Instead of going for it and laying it all out on the track and say, hey, if I can run a 55-second last lap, I can get a world record, I was holding back because I was afraid of tightening up down the home stretch. Steve, being the strong runner he was, I thought he could beat me. I regret that, truthfully. I regret that he brought me through such a great race and a great time, and I didn't lay it all out there on the track. That's a weakness I had. Waddle also didn't want to like who he was running against. The better to flog them. He wanted to run angry. And after the race, with the fans still clapping and cheering, Waddle began his victory lap. Steve jogged up beside Waddle and grabbed his arm and raised them together above their heads. Waddle thought, what are you doing running with me? This is my victory lap. How stingy, Waddle remembered. How stingy of me. Steve was endorsing me to the fans at Hayward Field. He was also saying, you did that because of me. And he was absolutely right. Ernie Cunliffe, who was the coach for the Air Force working with Waddle, found Steve and told him, it was a best of life for 7 other guys in the race, and you made it possible. You set it up for them. Steve often made it possible for others to level up. His gift to them. The few who beat him also ran out of their shoes. Waddle bettered his best time by nearly 4 full seconds to win this night, the fastest mile ever run at Hayward Field, this in the Temple of Milers. Waddle recalled, if he had not brought me through in 2:56, there's no way I could have run that fast. It was a valuable lesson for me to learn back then. I did reflect on it afterwards, thinking, no one's on an island. You have a family, you have coaches, you have teammates, you have competitors. All that together is what makes runners achieve their goals. Steve helped me learn that lesson. I was always grateful for that. The restoration meet was a beautiful illustration of Steve's evolution as a person. He started to see his rivals as peers, even if it meant falling on his sword to lift others up, all to give back to his community. These people, those stands. After the race, Steve was swarmed by children seeking autographs. He signed them attentively. One of Steve's older fans brandished a bottle of champagne in a paper bag. The fan offered Steve the bag, and Steve, appreciatively, took a swig.
That was nice, right? That's an excerpt that I read, and, I think I'm on the level. I think I'm as good. I think I got the voice too, man. I mean, I'm not throwing shade at Mr. Wayne, but I am saying I got chops. Okay, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to tellers their true tales about the true tales they tell. I'm Brendan O'Mara, the creep who won't stop talking to you. Okay, today we have Dane Huckelbridge. He returns to the show to talk about Queen of All Mayhem, the blood-soaked and mysterious death of Belstar, the most dangerous woman in the West. It's published by William Morrow. Dane's an interesting guy. He spends his life going between fiction and nonfiction. His last appearance on the show dealt with No Beast So Fierce, about a man-eating tiger, and his latest is part Western, part murder mystery, part genealogy. He's the author of the novel Castle of Water, and his work has appeared in Tin House, Lit Hub, The Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and The New Republic. All right, but first, a little bit of my usual housekeeping. Juiced up show notes are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can find links to hot blogs, tasteful nudes, and forums to sign up for the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, and the hottest thing since Bruce Springsteen's ass in tight jeans, Pitch Club, where I have a journalist audio annotate a pitch that earned publication. If you're a working journalist, you'll want to subscribe. If you're a journalism teacher, you'll want your students subscribing. Forever free. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com. And if you want to support the show and its infrastructure and my ego, you can also go to patreon.com/CNFpod. You get face-to-face time with me to talk some things out, depending on your tier. It's not very organized, but it's something. So Dane can be found at DaneHuckelbridge.com and on Instagram at Huckelbridge. In this pod, we talk about procrastination, writing around uncertainty, not having much of a routine, spacing out, niche hobbies, and staying motivated. Good stuff. Is that it for now? It's a little bit longer intro because of that audio excerpt, but hey, it's something. It was entertaining, wasn't it? Stay tuned for a parting shot about reverting to a little kid, but for now, cue up the montage. Producer Kevin,
deadlines help.
And then sort of sit back from the suckitude.
If you want tenacity, get the fuck off social media.
Don't be a dick.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
How do you handle the time between books when you're looking to start something new and in that period where maybe some ideas hit the wall and stick, some slide down the wall and you're like, God damn, I gotta move on to something else?
Yeah. That's a great question, because theoretically, in theory, I do, well, I mean, it's not theoretical, I do write fiction and nonfiction both. So between nonfiction books, I like to work on novels, I like to work on fiction. And I'm usually pretty good about that, but I'll be honest. Like sometimes you just need a break.
Yeah.
Sometimes, especially if you're gonna, hurry in a little bit, you got a deadline to turn it into your editor, this and that. So I try to be responsible and always have something to work on. But I've definitely had some stretches where my brain was frazzled, and I just took a few months off and, did other things. I think that's healthy too, because if you don't cultivate other interests or travel or spend time with friends, this and that, you don't have anything to write about. Right. That's where so much comes from real world experience. And you never know, you might be out with friends and one of them might mention an interesting story and, suddenly, boom, that's your next book idea. Or you might be at a family reunion and someone tells an interesting tale and that, a story, an idea comes out of that. So I think it's good to have balance, but I do try to keep busy ideally, but yeah, sometimes it takes a lot of effort. I love to procrastinate. And I'm really, it's just, I have this feeling sometimes like I have to sit and do nothing for several hours just to, to work for a couple hours. Mm-hmm. So I feel bad about that, but I do work pretty hard. When I do sit down and work, I really concentrate and really get a lot done. So I guess that's, it's sort of, I need these charging up periods before I sit down and, concentrate intently for a few hours. But, so yeah, I don't know. So that's the answer. I try to have things to write on and to work on between, but I do take time off to cultivate other interests and also just have fun and, living in Paris, enjoy the city, travel a little bit, all that good stuff.
Yeah, the procrastination thing is huge, I think, for anybody who's in the creative fields, and is particularly viral in the writing world, especially if you work from home, because there's always a chore to do. There's always dishes to be done. And you're like, oh, that's a good way to not have to do the work, not have to make the phone calls you need to make. I don't know, like, how does procrastination manifest for you?
Ooh. Well, okay. Well, this is kind of a funny story, but during COVID, whatever, and all these lockdowns, I was very responsible at the beginning. At the very beginning, I sat down, I worked on a novel, I was keeping busy. And then there was another big lockdown, and this time I was a little less motivated. And this time I think I read a lot and also rewatched a lot of the kind of the great American series, Breaking Bad or Sopranos or this and that. And then the third lockdown, though, I was done. I just didn't, I didn't want to, I was frazzled. I was frustrated. I was going crazy because it was sort of like being under house arrest here in France. And so I got a mini pool table, a billiard table.
Oh, wow.
And I decided there was a project. It was supposed to be kind of a children's toy. It's exactly half the size of a regular pool table. But it was designed to be a child's toy. So it came, with the quality wasn't great. The, what do you call it? The table was a little uneven. The balls were cheap. It came with these really tacky cues. And so my project became to create like a high class mini billiard lounge. And I bought this big overhead lamp so the light would shine down on it. I ordered some, was it Aramith? Are those the fancy billiard balls? I managed to find some mini ones that were exactly half size. I ordered some child size pro grade snooker cues from the UK that were great for, and I did a bunch of woodwork on the bottom to try to stabilize the bed and everything. And that became a great way to procrastinate. I spent many a night with a cocktail listening to jazz or whatever and just shooting round after round of mini billiards. So that was probably my most interesting way to procrastinate. Sometimes I'll goof around on my phone or watch stuff on the Netflix or whatever. And sometimes I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I just space out, which maybe it's good. I don't know. I think I kind of need it in a way. Like I need a lot of downtime to just kind of think about things or not think about anything. And like I said, space out. So I feel a little guilty about that, but I don't think I'm the only writer who does that. So maybe it's part of the process.
Well, I think you're right, Dane, in that a lot of that downtime, though it's not technically at a notepad scribbling or at your keyboard writing, it like that downtime is part of the writing.
I think so too. Yeah. I just don't think I could. I like I said, I kind of need that to focus. And if I was very frazzled or running around all the time, I didn't have the downtime. I think I couldn't do it. I think I really have to, I don't know. It's like in Ghostbusters when they're recharging their proton packs or whatever, it's kind of like zoom, 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 and it takes a while and then shoots out a burst of whatever. I mean, it's kind of like that. So I find I do need a fair amount of time ideally. Although sometimes too, when I have no choice, when I've got deadlines and a bunch of stuff due and whatever, sometimes that forces me to do good work. So that's true too. But I think I couldn't sustain that over a long period of time. I think if I was constantly at it, I think I'd burn out.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, and speaking of deadlines and other things, like what is some of the other writing or other projects that you have that might be the smaller rocks that fit around the big rocks of your book projects?
Oh, let's see. Well, I do try to read recreationally, and that's something I feel guilty about too, because I used to have so much more time and also so much more energy and less distraction to do it.
Yeah.
So when I first started out, when I was living in New York City, I read nonstop. And also I remember I didn't study literature or anything like that in university and college, so I felt like I had a lot of catching up to do. And so I started reading a lot, and I really, I read a ton of books at that time. And these days also, I just have less free time. I feel like my attention is pulled in different directions. But I do try to read. I try to read fiction. I don't read as many nonfiction books, ironically, but I have a subscription to the New Yorker, which is pricey. The paper subscription is pricey when you live in Paris. So that's good motivation. If I'm paying all this money for the subscription, I feel like, I need to read some of it. So I always try to read at least one or two articles from every issue. But those things pile up quick too. Before I know it, I've got a New Yorker stack, 2 feet high. But yeah, I try to do that. So reading is important. Again, I don't do quite as much as I'd like to, but that was one of my New Year's resolutions. So I've been trying to do that. I think music is important. I think music is sort of it's part of life. It's sort of it spiritually restorative or something like that. So I think listening to music, I like to, sometimes when I'm sort of spacing out, I like to have music in the background. And for spacing out, I like probably classical music or jazz music more, but I'm also a big fan of kind of classic rock and whatnot. I think socializing is just really important because, like I said before, with your friends, kind of interacting with people, so many good ideas just come unexpectedly, and you never know where they're going to come from or what kind of story you're going to hear. So I think that's important. And I think it's also kind of fun to have like weird niche hobbies, because sometimes inspiration comes from that too, or sometimes an idea. Like I mentioned my my mini billiard table. I don't have a huge collection, but I got into collecting vintage men's fragrances that no longer exist. And it all started, and I'm not even a guy, I don't wear really, like, I'm not a cologne guy. I don't even wear cologne that much. But when I was a kid, I remember on special occasions, my dad would wear Brut cologne.
Yeah.
And so it was like that Brut by Fabergé, and they don't really make it anymore. I think there's something you can get, but it's not the same stuff. And I remember it was always like a very nostalgic smell, and I was curious. It occurred to me like, oh, on eBay, maybe I could find some like old vintage Brut from the 80s or 90s. And I did find some. And that, I just thought that was really neat, because smell is so linked to the past, and it's something that's usually ephemeral. You know, the idea of preserving smells is just, it's something you don't usually think about, you know? And something about that got me interested. And I have like this kind of small collection of vintage colognes, most of which don't exist anymore. I think that's what I find intriguing. So I don't know, like weird little interests like that. And travel, yeah, I think travel is great too. Especially I love traveling around here in Europe, just because there's so many neat little regions. There's so many interesting local cultures and traditions and whatnot. And stories are just always popping up, always coming, popping into my head. And a lot of the fiction I have written was really inspired by my time living here in Europe, and just sort of the different interesting things and interesting people I've encountered. So I'd say those would be my main kind of, side rocks to the big rock of writing, I guess.
Yeah. No, it's so important to interface physically and in person if possible. We got sidelined with that with the pandemic and all. But I think of any good fortune I've ever had, or any little nugget of good fortune I've ever had, has really come as a result of interfacing publicly with people, be it for career-wise or just socially. And had I just been at home on my computer just trying to noodle around on the internet, I don't think any of those things might have come my way. But you never know what might befall you if you're just like in public, because that's where the juice is out there. As hard as it might be for introverted people or shy people to do that, that's where it is.
Yeah, no, I think that's critical. And there is this kind of cliche of writing being solitary, and a big component of it is. I mean, there is a big part of it. It's hard to avoid. I'm not one of those people who can go sit in a coffee shop or a cafe and work. I only like to really do. I get distracted too easy. I have a short shiny object passes. I'm looking for any excuse not to work. So I always work alone. So I do. At my place. So I do spend a lot of time alone. So that does make me, I think, crave interaction and going out and seeing new things to an extent. So that, and also, like you said, I think it's just important both for, networking in the sense of meeting people with shared interests, meeting people who work in the same field. Sometimes you meet people who are happy to help, or you're happy to help too, which is always nice. And I think that is kind of where the magic happens. That's where that's kind of where you fill up the well from going out and gathering all these experiences. And then I don't know, maybe it's like picking grapes or something. You go out and pick the grapes, and then you bring them home and kind of press them into wine or whatever, make it into something.
Yeah, I like that. You just meet people, whether you're interacting with writers or something too. And I think this comes with a little bit of being in the game for a long time. You might think that there's some degree of scarcity among stories, but I love nothing more than be like, oh, I know someone who has a certain interest. Yeah, this is kind of interesting and maybe I should do it, but it's more in their lane. So I'm going like, hey, have you heard of this? Like, you should do this. And I feel better like you do this story so I don't have to.
Yeah, sure. No, I've been there. I've definitely been there.
Yeah, there was a time in my, early freelancing, and probably 15 years ago or so, where it was much more like competitive and jealous and bitter. I'd be like, oh, this guy, how did he get that cover? I wouldn't have written it that way. And it was just like, this is bullshit. How did this guy get that story? And it's like, it didn't burn clean for me, Dane.
Yeah, no, I remember those days. And I think part of the reason, you have those kind of feelings of, not that you're never, I mean, obviously it never goes away completely, right. But one of the big differences when you're starting out is you have this idealized version of what it's like being a writer, getting published and whatever. And not that it's not, not a great, I love my job. I love what I do. But yeah, it's a hassle. It's a huge headache. It's just new problems. And I always had this notion in my head that there'd come a moment where, I'd be set. Everything would be on cruise control. I'd have, agent stuff set up, editor stuff set up, public, and then all sorts of unexpected things happen. I know what it's like to have editors and agents leave the business. I know what it's like to have imprints closed down. I know, sometimes just bad stuff outside of publishing. Sometimes it's just a bizarre news cycle, and it kind of sucks up all the oxygen, and nobody's thinking about what books are out.
Yeah.
And so there's a certain element you can't control, and I think I'm definitely I'd say, not that I still care, and I still, hope my stuff sells and does well and all these things like that. But I definitely don't take it as personally as I did when I was younger, because I know if you do, it's not sustainable. You'll drive yourself crazy if you're, having an existential crisis every time you can't sell a book, or you sell a book and it doesn't turn out the way you want, or it comes out, it doesn't sell as well as you'd hoped, or, you got to live your life. And, yeah, it can take a heavy toll. I think I like I said, when I was younger, I took a lot of the stuff much more seriously. And yeah, I remember going on, long depressions, long crises, whatever. I took it really personally, and which is also part of youth, I think, which is kind of nice too. You're much more, you tend to be a little more idealistic, a little more passionate about things. So I was definitely passionate, and then when things didn't work exactly as I wanted, I would take it very personally, and I'd be crushed and this and that. But yeah, these days I've been through enough ups and downs that, like I said, not that I don't care at all, but and I know from experience, anytime things are going well, to really enjoy it, but not get too comfortable, because it's very likely there'll be a downturn. And also when things are really not going well, not to throw in the towel and not to give up, because if you keep at it, things will eventually get better. And that hasn't happened to me just once. I mean, these kind of ups and downs have probably happened to me like 5 or 6 times over my career as a writer, where I, different times I felt like giving up, or things just weren't going the way I wanted. And then, there's, kind of a little miracle of some kind, or a little lucky break, and suddenly you're back.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, I love hearing you say, like, there are those moments where you might have given up, and I've had many of those inflection points over the last 20 years where I'm like, maybe this isn't, maybe I'm not cut out for this, and something like Godfather 3 like pulled me back in as much as I tried to leave, and I don't think I would be able to live with myself had I given up. And I think that's part of what kept me in. I think the podcast kept me in line, where it's just I'm hooked on doing this show, and I don't know what I would do without it. But I think without this, I probably would have gone into some other thing. I've taken innumerable day jobs over the 20 years where I'm like, oh, maybe I could do this. I worked in a wine cellar for a while. I'm like, oh, maybe I'm going to be a wine guy. And then I just couldn't live with myself not doing this, interacting with writers and trying to do narrative nonfiction. So it's just one of those deals where it's just like, I don't think I would have been able to live with myself. Sometimes external circumstances make you have to quit, be it financially or family or whatever. Yeah. But, independent of that, it was like, I need to see this through the end, because otherwise I don't know if I'd be able to live with myself.
Oh yeah, I definitely know that feeling, and I've been so frustrated at times over the last couple decades, I guess, that I definitely thought about it. But yeah, the same thing. I just never. It was just kind of like an itch I had to scratch. I kept at it, but that's also what I was saying. I think it's important to have interests and a life and things you do outside of just writing and worrying about writing, to sort of help you out, during those times when things maybe aren't going so good. Because if your whole life revolves just around writing and the act of writing and worrying about writing, and then if things, for one thing, I think it'll make your writing a little thin, because you won't have that much to write about. Yeah. You won't have like the real. I mean, that's why people, fiction or nonfiction, people want they want something that feels real, something that reflects life in some way, that offers a reflection on life. And you've got to live to have that, I think. But also just for very practical reasons. Yeah. If you go through a period where things aren't going well in the writing or the publishing or whatever, you can't just fall apart. You got to have other things to sustain you, because you never know. Like sometimes those downturns, they can last years, or they can, maybe you write a novel or try to pitch a nonfiction book you've been working on for a couple of years. That doesn't work. And if you're really committed and you want to go back to square one and start over, it might be another few years before you're trying again. So you gotta, that my experience anyway was just trying to devote my whole life to that. It wasn't very productive. I don't think it made my writing better to devote my whole life to it. And it just made me very like frustrated and sad a lot. Like it just wasn't like there weren't a lot of upticks, like if you want to write a love story, you gotta fall in love. If you want to write a good adventure story authentically, you have to have some adventures. If you want to write about history or a place or a time, you have to go out and experience it and interact with it.
Oh, for sure. And when you're sitting down to write, when you're like trying to remove those distractions and all the stuff when you're settling down, and what do you like to have in place, be it routines or rituals? So when you're going to have a day, like, oh yeah, today's a day I need to get 1,000 words done or more.
I don't have anything strict.
Yeah.
Kind of just when it feels right. At a certain point, I feel good about what I've done, and I feel like, like I've done a solid day's work. And then I'm starting to feel a little like, I feel good about what I did. I'm feeling a little tired, not really wanting to continue. And then, and then I call it a day. And when those days go well, it's a good feeling. Like that's a great feeling, knowing you did, you put in a day's work and you got a lot done, and you can take a break. And then I find I don't feel guilty at all afterwards. I can really enjoy myself. Or, if I put in a whole week of work and the weekend comes, I'll say, oh, I'm just going to take the weekend off and do fun and interesting stuff, and can do it guilt-free.
Yeah.
But sometimes I feel very guilty when I know, I've got something I need to be writing, need to be working on, and I keep putting it off. And that's not fun either. That sort of feeling of guilt and regret. It's very similar to, when I was a kid, not wanting to do homework on Sundays. Sunday would come around, I'd have homework to do for Monday. And I remember you'd put it off because you wanted to enjoy the day, but you couldn't enjoy the day anyway because you're kind of, stewing on it and churning and dreading it, even though usually it's not that bad once you sit down and do it. And I guess that's usually the case. Rituals. I just have a desk in my room, in my apartment. And when it comes time, I just sit and do it. And I procrastinate for a while. I look for other stuff to do, but at a certain point, it's just Geronimo. You got to dive in and do it. And it does help. One thing I've found with nonfiction, though, that helps in terms of motivation, unlike fiction, is nonfiction. When you sell the proposal and then you have to write it. And so it's not like fiction where you have to write the whole thing and then try to sell it, which can be hard because, the motivation isn't, you got to really dig deep for that motivation. But with nonfiction, they've got a pub date when your book is going to come out. They've given you, either half or 1/3 of your advance up front, and you're going to get the rest, when it's done or when it comes out. And so that's a pretty good motivation. I actually kind of appreciate that, because I need that little kick in the pants sometimes where it's like, okay, they already paid me, so I got to do it. Right. They've paid me for a service, and I've got to render the service. But then on top of that, you're going to get the rest of the money when you finish. So it's like a nice carrot at the end of the stick. So I find with nonfiction that does help too in terms of motivation, which for me is probably a good thing. I think that type of motivation is helpful.
With your latest book, I always love going to the acknowledgments too after I read it, because that's usually some good threads to pull on. And I love here you say this project never would have gotten off the ground without the incredible support of your editor, Nick Amphlett, and your agent, Renee Zuckerbrot. And I want you to maybe take us to that moment of how you got altitude, for a project like the Queen of All Mayhem. Like, what were those early conversations?
In this instance, it actually started with a conversation with my editor at the time. At the time, I was looking for an idea, I think, and I had a few I wanted to kind of pitch to him and talk about. And I'd worked with him before. And so I was on the phone, and I had these, like, a few ideas I'd been tinkering with, and none of them, I kind of got the, nah, like, I don't know if that'll work type response. And so I was sort of out of ideas, and I think at some point I just asked, well, what are you looking for? What are people looking for? What are good subjects to explore right now? And the response was, stories, historical stories set in America and stories about crime were always promising. And this is something that just happenstance just came up, but I'd been talking to another friend of mine who was an editor, and I'd talked to him about an article that never came to fruition. But one of the things I mentioned in the article was, when I was a little kid, my mom always said we were distantly related to Belle Starr, the female bandit from the Wild West. And I didn't know that much about it. I didn't know any details. It was just this story. We had a few stories like that, some of which I know are true. This one, it was rather ambiguous, and I talk about this in the book. But I just kind of casually mentioned this when we were having this conversation about ideas for new books. And in doing so, it was, something just clicked. It was like a light bulb went off. The record skipped off the vinyl. It was kind of, wait, my editor said, wait, tell me more about this Belle Starr. I told him a little bit I knew, which wasn't that much. He asked, like, could you write together a little summary of her life? I'm just curious, just, a page. And I did. And then from there, we were just off to the races. I guess there were some internal talks on their end, and they loved the idea, and they asked if I could do a biography about it. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to. And fortunately, I was very lucky in this regard. I think once I dug in and started doing the research about Belle Starr, it actually turned out to be her life even more thrilling and kind of adventurous and dramatic than I expected. And that's something I've noticed just from the past. One of the things about nonfiction, as I mentioned, is you have to do this proposal ahead of time, which means, I mean, bluffing sounds negative. Not that you're bluffing, but you're kind of saying, oh, I can write this thrilling, captivating, 300-page book.
Yeah.
You just have to pay me to do it.
Yeah, with almost none of the research done yet. Like, just enough. Yeah,
you haven't really dug in. So you never know exactly what you're going to find. You're always a little nervous if there's really going to be enough there to fill up a book. And I've always been nervous doing this, but it's never been a problem. It's always worked out well, and I think the stories have worked out even better than I expected. And in this case, that was absolutely true. It turned out, digging in, doing the research, going through archives, and learning more about her life, she turned out to be even a much more interesting and dramatic and adventurous character than I imagined. And I think the book turned out even better than I imagined. I thought there was a story there, but it turned out to be a great story. So I was really, really excited about it when it was finished.
Yeah, and the story to me, and it really struck me as a story of reinvention in a time where, and agency in a time for when women didn't have a certain measure of that agency. She took it upon herself to make a name for herself and a new name for herself.
Yeah, and I think that's the essence of her story. She came from a fairly prosperous family, not that super rich, but they were prosperous in their community, kind of community leaders. Her father was a breeder of horses, was a stock farmer, and also ran this kind of prominent hotel in Carthage, Missouri. And they were regarded as pillars of the community. They were doing well money-wise. And she very easily could have just slipped into kind of a Southern Belle type role, that was common at that time for kind of an educated woman of Southern parents, and married a wealthy farmer or rancher, plantation owner, or moved to Dallas and kind of been a socialite. There's a lot of things she could have done, and she just wanted none of that. She wanted total freedom to pursue her own destiny, and the freedom, to do what she wanted, go where she wanted, love who she wanted, live how she wanted. And at that time, there wasn't really a legal means for her as a woman to do that. And so she chose an illegal way. She chose, as I say in the book, the the way of the gun, because that was the way that offered her the freedom. You know, if legally she wasn't allowed to live the type of life she wanted, then she would do it illegally, and that's exactly what she did. And she became an outlaw and rode with a number of other famous outlaws. She was, she married Jim Reed, who's a famous outlaw in his own right. Also friends with Cole Younger, apparently friends with Jesse James, and helped hide him, it's believed, at some point at her outlaw ranch. She had this very, very colorful, adventurous life, was pursued strongly by both federal authorities and tribal authorities, because she spent the last decade of her life living in the Cherokee Nation, married into this local Cherokee family, a branch of which had its own kind of criminal enterprise going. And so yeah, she had this extremely colorful, wild life, and it turned out to be a good story.
What was the challenge for you in writing, and specifically writing this book, when there was a lot of uncertainty around her? There's a lot of like, perhaps it was like this, maybe it went down like this, or this could have happened. How did you navigate all of that uncertainty as you were writing it?
Sure. Just writing about that era, the sort of Wild West in general, is hard because there's so much mythology around.
Yeah.
And it gets really tricky to separate the fact from the fiction.
Yeah.
And documentation in many cases can't be trusted either. For example, Belle Starr, on one of her marriage certificates, lied about her age. Or, newspaper reporters at that time, they would invent details to try to sell newspapers. And there's also a lot of oral history that later becomes written history. You can't always rely on, and different versions of stories, depending who's telling them. So it gets very tricky writing history. And I think I say as much in the opening of the book, that trying to write her biography is less like an academic exercise and more kind of an artistic one, of trying to render a portrait of her as faithfully as possible, while also acknowledging a certain amount of interpretation. And then on top of all of that, she was an outlaw, and essentially she was involved in organized crime. So, they didn't keep records of this stuff. It was kind of known, sort of the same way, Al Capone, they ended up having to bust him on tax evasion charges, even though everyone knew he was the leader of this huge, criminal enterprise. It was very hard to prove because there wasn't any documentation. And I think the same, to a certain extent, is true of her. And so what you end up having to go after are things like the resources that authorities put into putting her behind bars, which are considerable, what she was charged with. And she did get arrested and do time for horse theft, but she was also arrested another time for horse theft and also for armed robbery. Those charges she beat, but I think she was guilty personally, but that's my take. And then you also have to, you look at the notes, obviously, from the court records, what they're saying about her. Then you look at the journalists, the newspapers. What are they saying about her? How is she described in the press? And they definitely did, describe some of her capers. They did describe her as this kind of outlaw queen, the leader of this band of outlaws. I mean, she was acknowledged as such at the time. It wasn't invented after her death. I guess beyond that, you do rely to a certain extent kind of on things more like folklore and written accounts, eyewitness accounts, things like that have been recorded. But I mean, I think you have to take that with an even bigger grain of salt. You use all of these documents together and accounts and this and that, and you try to decipher. You have to be a detective of sorts, and you have to say, all right, these are the clues. We don't have any documented evidence what sort of illegal activity she was up to, but she was living with the Starr family, this family in the Cherokee Nation, who were known for kind of smuggling and stealing horses. She was claimed to be a leader of a band of horse thieves. She was charged with horse theft and did time for it. And she was also came from a family. She had a huge passion for horses herself. So, you can make claims like, all right, she was probably the leader of a ring of horse thieves, among other things. So, but again, a lot of it's hard to prove. It's always, anytime you're writing a historical book, it's hard, but it gets, like I said, especially tricky when you're talking about organized crime from the Wild West era.
Yeah. Well, and structurally, you open the book with this sort of seedy, nefarious scene of Belle's murder by this kind of shadowy, unknown figure. And so, like, right off the bat, we're introduced to her as someone worthy of a target. Just take us to that moment, just creatively, of like, oh yeah, this is how I want to enter this story on her.
I like the idea of starting with something to really draw the reader in. I think that accomplishes it, and it sets the tone right away that this is going to be a murder mystery. And, I think I'm definitely not the first person to do this. I think it's sort of, there are a number of Scorsese movies and stuff like that start at the end, or a movie like Carlito's Way is one that comes to mind, that starts with, that a lot of these sort of organized crime movies that start with some sort of disaster, some kind of killing, whatever, and that draws you in. Yeah. And then the rest of the movie is you learning how it came to be, how this came to pass. And I think I like this idea. And also, too, just from a very practical standpoint, the intro beyond this, the first couple chapters of when she's a girl growing up in Missouri and her family history, it's interesting, but it's not the most action-packed part of the book. I mean, there's a lot more action later. So I think it occurred to me that, all right, if the first couple chapters are going to be sort of setting the stage for her as a girl and where her family came from and whatever, not going to have a lot of firsthand accounts of gunfights and, raids and bank robberies, stuff like that, that it would be nice to start on a note that draws people in, that sort of has some action to it, and that people know what they're in for. And like I said, you're basically just setting up this mystery. Who killed Belle Starr? That's the mystery. And I think also, too, from a practical standpoint, it sort of made sense to know she died this way ahead of time, that she was gunned down. I think, off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember where, but I just remember thinking that it worked with the sort of structure of the book, where you went into it knowing that someone was going to gun her down and end her life. But I like the beginning. I think it's a cool way to start a book. I don't know. Yeah. It's true. And again, that's also evidence for that she was, she wasn't a poser. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. I mean, she was the type of person who made the kind of enemies who would blow her off a horse with a shotgun and assassinate her, basically, and then execute her, kind of gangland style, point blank range with a second barrel. And that's what happened to her. So, and it makes a great ending for the book too. I think the final part of the book, I won't give anything away, but it delves really deep into this murder mystery and explores the suspects and possible motivations and things like that. So I think it makes for a good ending too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and I'm thinking of The Usual Suspects too, where that movie starts out at that sort of bungled mission, and then we come back to it at the very end to learn who Kaiser Sose is and everything. There's an element of that I'm now connecting with your book.
Like I said, I'm not the first person to use this sort of device in a criminal narrative, but I think it does work, and I think if you're going to do a book about Belle Starr and you want to get people, show them right away the kind of person she was and the type of trouble she got into, I think that scene where she's blown off her horse is a good way to go.
Yeah, and there's little by way of stuff that is like from her pen or her vocalizing. So I imagine when you came across the things, whether she was quoted in newspapers or like the very few letters you were able to procure, like this one very long letter that she wrote to her daughter, Pearl, that must have been really energizing to come across something like that, because when you get a hold of that, things really start to come to life in a way that's like, oh, this is really cool.
There are very few written sources, direct primary sources written by her, but there are a few things there. I mean, there's an interview that allegedly she gave to a newspaper. There's, I guess, a couple of letters that she wrote that I include in the book in their entirety, just because it's so rare to hear her in her own voice. But even then, though, again, I'll go back to what I said before. There have historically been some people who doubted the authenticity of these letters. I went over them. I think they're authentic because they include details that there's really no way for, very small details that I don't think could have been forged, knowing about her life, knowing this and that. And I'm pretty convinced they're authentic. And, I was totally comfortable including them as written by her, and they've generally been regarded as written by her. But yeah, like I said, you always have to have some degree of a grain of salt, because it's hard to prove anything is true. But yeah, I think the letters are authentic, and they are very cool because, yeah, actually you have this sort of mysterious, little-known character, this legendary outlaw, and just getting a little glimpse into her psyche, and learning things you didn't know about her, but also verifying things you did. That you learned from her letter to her daughter that the myths were true about her horsemanship, that she was really like she talks about sort of breaking and taming horses and whatnot, that she was good at it. One of the interesting things is she instructs her daughter. This is when she's going to trial, and she sent her daughter away from the Cherokee Nation to go stay with friends in Kansas, I believe. And it becomes clear, this sort of paranoia that she tells her daughter, don't tell people who you are. If anyone writes to you, don't give away where you are. Only only open letters from me, whatever it is. Because I think she genuinely was worried for her daughter's safety. And it becomes clear, I make this point in the book, that she did have powerful enemies. It's not clear from the letter who they are. My guess is probably unfriendly factions within the Cherokee Nation, because the family she married into had enemies there as well. My guess would probably be that, which is why she sent her away. But it's not clear. But you start to see, like, when you go back to that murder mystery at the end, her own murder mystery, all the different suspects, like, all right, clearly there were people who she thought wished her harm, and maybe the sort of paranoid tone in her letter isn't so paranoid after all.
Yeah, and there's a moment in that letter as well where she encourages Pearl to basically keep her nose in her books, and study, which harkens back to Belle's upbringing, where she was, educated and literate.
Yeah, one thing about her is she had a son and a daughter, and she definitely wanted, kind of the typical organized crime mobster cliche, kind of wanted something better for her children. Didn't want them to follow the road she did. She wanted them to be legitimate. But she was also in some ways, yeah, not the best mother in the world, which you can expect from this sort of criminal riding with this gang of cutthroats and outlaws, going on the run from the law, robbing people, all these things she was doing. And she wasn't present for big chunks of her children's lives. And yeah, and I think it caused a lot of problems. They grew up to resent her for it. There was a lot of animosity between them, not love too, I think, but also there were complicated relationships. And in the end, I think, the lifestyle, she clearly loved her children very much, but she did have some failings as a parent. And I think they kind of caught up with her children. I mean, her son was gunned down in some kind of drunken dispute in a bar shortly after her death. So it's unclear. And her son did get involved in crime, did do some time, I believe, for horse theft, off the top of my head. And then he tried to go straight and even tried to make his way into law enforcement. But I think the pull was too great, and he ended up getting in some kind of drunken fight in a bar. There's different versions of the story, some of which claim he was there on official law business, but I honestly, based on what I've read, I don't think that's true. I think he just got drunk and unruly in a bar and got in a gunfight and died. So he died shortly after his mother did. And then her daughter, Pearl, she lived to a ripe old age, but she ended up working in a brothel. And there's a story, I can't prove this is true, I don't think, but there's a story that she did it to raise money to help her brother, for his legal fees. So I'm not sure if that's true or not, but apparently she did start working in a brothel. And I don't think these kind of frontier, Fort Smith, Arkansas, Oklahoma, whatever brothels they probably weren't the most pleasant places, but she bounced around a number of brothels. But she did, toward the end, become something of a madam. So I guess, I think in this latter part of her life, she was a madam at a brothel, and she lived a ripe old age. And I believe she eventually married, and if I remember correctly, ended up living in Arizona or something like that, well into the 20th century. So, I mean, so her daughter lived, but had kind of a pretty difficult youth. and her son was gunned down in a drunken gunfight, which is basically not far from what happened to almost every man in her life. And when you look at Belle Starr, the amount of bloodshed is just her. You know, 2 of her brothers died in gun violence. 3 of her 4 husbands, I believe, died in gunfights. The violence was rampant. It wasn't, in this instance, it wasn't just this kind of Wild West myth, you know, created for Hollywood. It was real. I'd say it was almost even more so than what you expect. I was kind of surprised at the level of violence in this milieu that she ran with. Most people died from gunfights, and a few ended up in prison. But for the most part, you know, most of the important men in her life died committing crimes, you know, shootouts with law enforcement, or just died in sort of drunken brawls, drunken gunfights, duels, whatever.
As she moved into and lived in Cherokee Nation, there's a moment too where you write that, you know, she was done being, she was done being a gangster, but she was going to be a gang lord. And so what changed for her as she made that transition in her life?
Well, prior to that, she'd been married to Jim Reed. They were from kind of roughly the same part of Missouri. He was a Confederate guerrilla, a bushwhacker during the war. I don't think he fought alongside her. He was with Quantrill's Raiders. Her brother, Bud, wasn't with Quantrill's Raiders, but they probably knew each other. Like, I think it was kind of a small world. So I think they knew each other from before that. And so he went back to the Missouri days, and a lot of these Missouri Confederate guerrillas, when the war ended, because they'd never been official Confederate soldiers, they were just kind of, you know, just guerrillas basically. They weren't necessarily afforded the same clemency and protection that uniformed Confederates were after when the war ended, and there were a lot of people who wanted them hanged and prosecuted and dead, you know, around that area, because the violence at that time was just horrible. You know, lots of barn burnings and slayings and massacres and lynchings and everything. So a lot of these former guerrillas fled Missouri, and also the economy was just in total ruins too. So it was just a scorched wasteland. A lot of them resettled in Texas. That was kind of the area specifically not too far from Dallas. And that's where Belle Starr's family went when they left Missouri. And a lot of these other Missouri Confederate families, many of whom also been guerrillas, they went too. One of whom was Jim Reed, who she ended up marrying. And Reed followed in the footsteps of a lot of these guerrillas where there wasn't, they'd picked up all these military skills, these guerrilla skills during the war. You know, they learned how to shoot pistols from horseback and, rob Union cash depots and rob Union trains and things like that. They picked up these very specific skills. And when the war was over, they had no way to earn money and no kind of like legal trade to ply. And so they just used these skills and basically created what we think of as Wild West banditry. It all had its roots really in what they were doing against Union forces and Union militias during the war. So that's why these were the guys who did the first kind of like daytime bank robberies, the same train heists, the same stagecoach robberies, all these sorts of things that you think of as classic Wild West, outlaw behavior. There was these guerrillas who introduced it to the Wild West, and they started doing it across the frontier, not just in Missouri. And they started doing it in Texas. They started doing it in what was then called Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma. And one of these guerrillas was Jim Reed, who Belle Starr married. And he was an interesting character. I see him as like a bit of a, kind of feckless, kind of a ne'er-do-well. And you think of these sort of, mob movies or crime movies, there's often this character who kind of can't keep their mouth shut, or after a big score, can't stay out of trouble and get pinched, or, these sort of characters. And he always struck me reading about his life as that type of character. And they did have one huge score, and I think it was really just kind of dumb luck. There was the Grayson robbery, where in the Indian Territory, there's this one kind of prominent member of tribal leadership who apparently had a lot of money hidden under the floorboards or wherever it was in his ranch. And Jim Reed and some of his buddies found out about this, and they went to go hold him, stick him up. And Belle Starr went along with them kind of as like a sidekick. And the way I look at it, I think she was kind of like the lookout, she kind of like maybe held fresh horses and was sort of the lookout outside while they went in and did the dirty work. But when, after they robbed it, they ended up making off with $32,000 in gold, which is a lot today. Back then, that was, that's enormous. That's a fortune beyond comprehension. And they should have been set for life. And I think Belle Starr thought that they were. And instead, her husband took their cut and just blew it all in all the ways you could imagine a Wild West outlaw doing. Horse races, gambling at the saloon, whiskey, brothels, all that stuff. And on top of blowing all the money, he kind of went on this wild spree and picked up a mistress. That was really what drove him and Belle Starr apart. They still were technically married, but he kind of went off on his own, went on this other crime spree with this mistress, and eventually got killed by a bounty hunter. And that's a great scene too. The scene where the bounty hunter kills him is just like, it's like something out of a movie. It's just phenomenal. So at that point, Belle is a widow. Her husband's been gunned down in this bloody melee by this bounty hunter, and she's kind of fed up. And she kind of drifts for a while. Eventually, she goes in. She kind of shacks up with this sort of small time gambler, possibly outlaw. And they do get married, and something happens. It's still unclear exactly what, but they stayed married for just a couple of weeks, and then he took off. And I think that was the last straw for Belle. And at this point, she'd always been kind of a sidekick, And I think, and I mentioned this kind of like Anglo frontier, male-dominated frontier. That's all she could be. And I think she finally reached her breaking point. She got fed up, and because many of these Confederate guerrillas she hung out with, including her ex-husband, had a lot of dealings with the Cherokee Nation, in part because they'd helped them as guerrillas, fought alongside them during the Confederate War, and they'd forged this criminal alliance afterwards with like smuggling and horse theft, things like that. She was just fed up with this world and went straight to Indian Territory, straight to the Cherokee Nation, and almost directly married into the Starr family. And she married Sam Starr, who was the son of Tom Starr, who's this legendary Cherokee figure. And his story, you could write a whole other book about him. Was a political rebel, kind of a warlord, organized crime lord. There's different ways of looking at it, but he was this powerful sort of legendary figure who was very much respected and feared in the Cherokee Nation at that time. Respected too. A lot of people respected him. There's often been this debate about how much of he was a gangster and how much he was just kind of a political rebel against the Cherokee government power. He was both, in my opinion, but people could dispute that. But she married right into this sort of powerful family with a history of violence and criminal behavior, and she got right to business. And she started getting involved in organized crime, sort of the Starr family business, alongside her husband Sam to an extent. And eventually he would die in a gunfight. You could kind of say defending her honor to an extent, but he'd been riding her favorite horse, Venus, and there was a family who they're actually related to called the Wests, and Frank West, who was actually a cousin of some kind. There'd been this feud between them because Frank West was in Cherokee law enforcement, and Sam Starr was, something of an outlaw, and he shot him off the horse. He was kind of fleeing from tribal authorities, and killed the horse in the process. And there was a bit of a truce after that, but there was still this lingering bad blood. And at a Christmas party, Belle, according to legend anyway, was playing. She loved to play the piano. Was playing the piano or possibly a pedal organ at the festivities. And Frank West, this lawman they had this blood feud with, showed up down below to warm himself by a bonfire down below this cabin. And either Sam, of his own volition, went down to confront him and challenge him to sort of a duel, or Belle. There's one story that says, go get that son of a bitch. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's one version of the story. Regardless, because of his anger at being wounded himself and also for killing his wife's favorite horse, he went down to challenge Frank West to a gunfight. And, again, this is also very cinematic. They both essentially pulled their guns at the same time, both shot at each other, both died. But apparently Sam Starr lived just a second or two long enough to stay on his feet and see his sort of arch enemy fall to the ground dead, and then he tumbled dead a minute later.
Mm.
So just like that, Belle became a widow again. And after that, she kind of started to freelance. I think. I think they'd been running their own criminal gang, and I think after that, she to a certain extent became the de facto leader of this criminal gang operating out of the Cherokee Nation, out of her, and the headquarters was this little ranch. Makes it sound sprawling. It wasn't sprawling per se, but this homestead ranch called Younger's Bend.
Yeah, it's a trip. You know, her whole story, and especially in the final chapter where you're basically like laying out all the suspects and like eliminating some, and this one could be, and then this one seems a little more plausible. Like it's a really great summation to spending some time with Belle and in the life she led and the life all these nefarious ne'er-do-wells led. So it was like just a really good rollicking read, Dane. But as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I always love asking the guests, you in this case, just for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners, and that's just something that you think is fun and cool that's making you happy, and you want to share with the listeners.
Would you prefer a book or anything?
You know what? I like, most people recommend books, but I always encourage anything. Just sometimes to get out of the reader-writer mindset and go to some other place.
All right, let me think a second. I'll start with a book,
Sure.
And then if something else comes to mind. But this project definitely got me interested in Western literature, which I'd read a lot of history books, but not necessarily a lot of novels. I've been working on this other little writing project on the side that involves choosing books on the subject. And 2 books I read recently that they're kind of about Western type books. I actually haven't finished either of them yet. So one I just started, and the other I'm about half done with. But one is Death Comes from the Archbishop, which is a really interesting book. I think it's from the 1920s, and it's told from an interesting perspective because it's about a priest or whoever who's been sort of promoted to bishop and sent to the diocese of what was then New Mexico. This is during the Wild West times, because before this had all been part under Spanish or French control, and later Mexico, and so there was this need for to begin managing this really wild frontier with what was nominally Catholic, and I thought it was just a really interesting perspective because so much of when you talk about the West, the sort of narratives, it comes from these very Anglo perspectives. And it's easy to forget that most of it was controlled by France or Spain at some point, and by extension the Catholic Church. So that's interesting, an interesting book, an interesting perspective. So that's one thing I would suggest. And also, I just started True Grit, which is apparently, I've only read the first couple of chapters, but I'm loving it so far. It's better even than I expected. So based on only the few chapters I've read, I would say though that that's a good book to check out if you're looking for a novel about the West.
Nice. Cool. Well, I like the sound of that. That sounds great. Well, Dane, this was awesome to get to talk to you again about just how we go about this line of work we're in, and getting to talk Belle Starr and Queen of All Mayhem. So this was great. I'm so glad we got to have another conversation.
Yeah, the pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me back. I really enjoyed it.
Yes. That was nice. That was fun. Dane's a cool dude. I wish I was Dane, living in Paris, sipping on gin and juice. So last weekend, we were attending the Emeralds games, the minor league team here in town, and I'm one of those rare nerds who keeps score at a baseball game, keeps me engaged, keeps me from the booze. In this game against the Vancouver Canadians, Jonah Cox, one of the fastest runners in all of minor league baseball, seriously, hit a tailing line drive to right field. The right fielder gambled by diving for the ball. He missed it, and the ball rolled to the fence. You knew at this point Jonah had a chance at the rare inside the park home run. He's screaming around the bases, round and first, into second, down to third. Right fielder has the ball, hits the cutoff man. Cutoff man fires home. Jonah dives for the plate, and he beat the throw. Thrilling play. Following the game, there was a pretty cool drone show, so we stayed late. After it was over, we exited the concourse, and turns out we passed Jonah and a couple of the other players who, now in civilian clothes, had stayed to watch the drone show. There were also about 8 young women to their side. So, to quote a 1990s baseball commercial featuring Greg Maddux and Tom Glavine, chicks dig the long ball. Anyway, as we exited the stadium, I told Melanie that we had just passed Jonah and a couple others. I should have him sign my notebook. Yeah. She's like, well, go back. I'm like, well, should I? I mean, I don't want to bother him. And she's like, yeah, go. So I was like getting nervous. I'm like, well, who the fuck cares? I'm like all nervous, my butterflies. I'm like, oh boy, what am I going to say? But I went back in the stadium and meekly sidled up to Jonah. And I was like, hey, Jonah, awesome inside the park home run. He said, well, thank you very much. I said, would you mind signing my scorebook on your score line? He's like, sure. And he signed it, shook my hand. He was super gracious, didn't seem annoyed that I had interrupted him in his conversation, and otherwise he was just super nice. And I walked away feeling like a little kid. And let's just zoom in on this moment for a little bit. I truly felt like a 10-year-old. I'm 45 fucking years old. I was 21 when Jonah was born. He was born 5 weeks before 9/11, like the OG 9/11, 2001. He turns 24 on August 4th. He's listed as 6'3", but I think it's closer to 6'1", and I'm a mere 5'9", if my vertebrae are adequately hydrated. But I felt like such a little loser. I was like, hey, Mr. Jonah, great game. Can you sign my notebook? Melanie and I, after the game, went to Salt and Straw because they were having a ice cream promotion where if you said, make it a double, they gave you an extra scoop for free. So we go get ice cream. We joked around. We're like, hey, Mr. Jonah, you want to come get ice cream with us? And so on. Here I am, like an old dude in his eyes. And make no mistake. Remember when you were in your low 20s and you saw someone in their 40s? They were old as shit. Old balls. It was bizarre. I forgot for a moment that I'm this creepy old dude, but I truly felt like a little leaguer asking for an autograph. To me, it's a fun keepsake, and I doubt Jonah will ever sign someone's scorebook ever again, and I doubt he's even given it a moment's thought since that Friday night. I'm a guy who will find any excuse to beat the shit out of himself for the most minor infractions. And I didn't do anything wrong, except maybe being a weirdo middle-aged guy asking for an autograph. But there weren't any children around. They didn't muscle anyone out of the way. No one was talking to him except a couple of his teammates. Nobody paid them any attention, save for the group of beautiful young female baseball fans. And I remember going all the way back to 2006 when I met the writer and immersive journalist Ted Conover at a residency, at a MFA residency. He was on the podcast for episode 50, if you want to check that out. It holds up. The audio might not be great, as good as it is now, but it holds up. Good stuff. But I remember feeling similarly meek and shy when I approached him to have him sign a copy of my book, Coyotes. And that's the kind of kid I was growing up. Try to disappear and be invisible. It's best to be invisible. Learn that from my mother. It's best to be a doormat for people to walk all over than to cause a stir, because you don't want to ruffle any feathers. You don't want to disturb the water. It's okay. Yeah, it kind of sucks that that these people are walking all over you, but it's okay. Just it'll pass, and then you can say thank you for stabbing me in the back. It's okay. You don't want to make him any more upset. So yeah, got an autograph. He couldn't have been nicer, which was pretty cool. His sister, turns out, is a star softball player for the U of O. So they got good blood, man. They got good blood. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do interviews, see ya.